I was having dinner recently with an acquaintance, and I mean, he is the absolute poster child for modern optimization.
Oh, one of those.
Totally. He spent the first 20 minutes just showing me the data from his smart ring and his glucose monitor. And he was practically glowing as he was swiping through these charts, explaining how he'd biohacked his sleep and balanced his dopamine with cold plunges. He'd quantified his entire existence into a series of green efficiency scores.
Right, he was winning the game.
To him, this data was the ultimate proof that he was winning at life. He'd broken himself down into these chemical parts and the machine was running perfectly. But then the energy just shifted completely. The moment he put his phone down, that giddy enthusiasm just evaporated. He looked exhausted, almost hollow, and he admitted that despite the perfect biomarkers, he felt completely untethered, anxious, isolated, and just numb. It was such a jarring contradiction. He had this high-definition map of his biology, but he had absolutely no idea how to navigate the territory of his actual life. It reminded me exactly of that old biology class experiment, where you dissect a frog to understand how it works.
Of course.
You map every muscle and every nerve, and you understand the mechanics perfectly. But in the process, you've made one fatal error.
You've killed the frog.
You've killed the frog.
Yeah.
And that, right there, is the central tension we're going to unpack today. This deep dive is all about that crisis of meaning that happens when which is, the scientific method of breaking things down, or reductionism.
Right.
When that map kills the territory, the vast, complex reality of life where the whole is so much greater than the parts, which is emergence. We're looking at the philosophical, the psychological, and I think the social cost of reducing human existence to just chemistry and data.
What's so fascinating is that your anecdote, it perfectly sets up the problem of the dominant worldview of the 21st century. It really illustrates that paradox of being objectively well, but subjectively completely unwell.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We're starting with the philosophical map that we've all kind of inherited. What exactly is this dominant worldview, and why does it struggle so much to account for that feeling of hollowness?
Well, the foundational commitment, especially among scientists and a lot of contemporary philosophers, is materialism. It's often called physicalism.
Okay.
At its core, this theory asserts that the only things that fundamentally exist are physical things, objects that have measurable properties, size, shape, location, motion, and their interactions are determined entirely by the laws of physics.
So if you can't weigh it, measure it, or poke it with a stick, it doesn't really exist.
That's a great way to put it. It creates this kind of ontological hierarchy. If something seems non-physical like a thought, or a psychological state, or a moral truth, the physicalist argues that it must either be a physical thing when you look closer, or it has to rely on and be determined by the physical.
And there's a specific term for that reliance.
There is. We use the term supervenience. If a mental state, let's call it A, supervenes on a physical state, B, it just means that there can be no change in that mental state A without a corresponding change in the physical state B.
Oh, okay.
Think of a photograph.
Yeah.
The image, A, supervenes on the pixels. B, you can't alter the photo without altering the underlying pixels.
So the mental is completely dependent on the physical. The consequence of that is just. It's massive. I mean, the physical facts of the universe are considered the ultimate determining facts for all other truths.
Exactly. And this is where the profound psychological and social consequences really start to emerge. Because if the universe is fundamentally nothing more than physical particles following deterministic laws, then concepts like love, purpose, moral duty, subjective beauty,
The stuff that makes life worth living?
stuff that makes life worth living, all of that, because you can't find it under a microscope, gets reduced to mere epiphenomena.
And epiphenomena, just to be clear, means they're kind of side effects, or in some views, just outright illusion.
That's right. They're dismissed because they don't have any causal power separate from the chemistry of the brain. The universe, when you look at it through this lens, loses its inherent purpose. It just becomes a cold, dead machine.
And if purpose and morality are stripped of any objective reality, then they just become subjective, arbitrary things we invent for comfort. This has to be the root of that spiritual or existential blindness you mentioned.
It is. If the universe doesn't objectively care about me, why should I care about my life beyond just, basic survival and comfort?
Which brings us straight back to my acquaintance, the data architect. Let's call him Elias. He achieved a kind of materialist perfection.
He's a perfect case study in the failure of reductionism to deliver holistic well-being. Elias took the materialist map, the whole quantified self movement, and he applied it perfectly. He quantified his sleep, his nutrition, his hormones. He was running that biological algorithm at what physics would call peak efficiency. The map of his inputs was screaming success.
But the territory, his lived experience, was anxious and profoundly hollow.
And that contradiction is often amplified by the framework itself. If Elias believes he is nothing more than a biological machine, then when the machine runs perfectly and he still feels terrible, the anxiety just deepens. He has no reason to suffer within that framework.
Right. The suffering itself becomes an error message he can't debug.
Exactly. Suffering is viewed as a mechanical fault that should have been solved by optimizing the inputs. The inability of his map to explain his internal reality just creates more distress.
This really sounds less like a personal failure on his part and more like a systemic failure of the philosophical assumptions guiding our whole society. You mentioned this links to broader trends in Western societies.
Yep, precisely. We've seen this rapid secularization and a rise in radical individualism over the past few decades. And look, while individualism promotes essential ideas like autonomy and self-expression, it often does so by fracturing the traditional social structures, family, community, religion, that historically provided shared narratives and moral guidance.
So we kind of threw out the moral compass with the bathwater of outdated dogma.
In many cases, yeah. The unintended consequence is that without those communal guidelines for meaning, individuals are left completely adrift in an overwhelmingly complex world. They're expected to generate their own meaning from scratch, all alone.
That's an incredible burden.
It is, and for many, it leads directly to a profound crisis of meaninglessness. And you can see this in public health data. It reflects this in rising rates of anxiety, depression, and just a generalized feeling of alienation.
When people lose that deeper guidance, the sources seem to point out that they often fall back on a pretty shallow substitute for fulfillment. This distinction between the two types of happiness feels really crucial here.
It absolutely is. When genuine, deep purpose is absent, people often default to seeking what's called hedonic happiness. This is the immediate pursuit of pleasure, comfort, and immediate gratification.
So the quick dopamine hits from buying something new or getting likes on social media or even just optimizing your biology.
Exactly, like tracking biomarkers just to see that green score light up.
Yeah.
The satisfaction is immediate, but it's incredibly fleeting. It's a vicious cycle. Hedonic satisfaction is inherently temporary.
You always need another hit.
You always need another hit. It requires perpetual striving and consumption just to maintain a baseline of feeling okay. This keeps people perpetually dissatisfied, anxious, and stuck on that optimization treadmill.
And the alternative to that is?
The contrast is eudaimonic happiness. This is rooted in long-term purpose, personal growth, cultivating meaningful relationships, and contributing to something greater than yourself.
It's the hard stuff.
It's the hard stuff. It's challenging work that sometimes involves sacrifice and difficulty, but it provides deep, sustainable satisfaction. Unfortunately, when the societal infrastructure for finding meaning collapses, the complex, long-term work of eudaimonic pursuit is often abandoned in favor of the easier, immediate, hedonic approach that consumer culture promotes.
So we've optimized the shell, but we've completely starved the core. We've managed the inputs, but we've ignored the meaning-making apparatus. So if reductionism provides a map that makes perfect sense of the physical universe but leaves human life feeling hollow, we have to ask, where does the map actually break down conceptually?
And that leads us directly into the philosophical core of the problem, the mind-body dilemma. When a materialist tries to reduce mental things, like my memory of my childhood home, or the desire for chocolate, the feeling of joy down to purely physical things, like specific neural firing patterns, they face this enduring philosophical hurdle known as the mind-body problem. How do you get subjective experience out of objective matter?
And the most direct challenge to that reduction is this concept of qualia. Can you define that for us in a bit more detail?
Sure. Qualia, the singular is qual, are the intrinsic, qualitative, subjective properties of our experience. It's the what it is likeness of feeling pain, or seeing that unique shade of blue in the sky, or tasting the bitterness of a strong coffee. It's the raw, felt sensation.
The experience itself.
The experience itself. Physicalists have to explain how these subjective feelings arise from objective matter, or they have to argue that qualia don't really exist as independent things.
And that feels like the exact point where the reductionist map just runs out of ink. You can map the wavelength of light, the retinal processing, and the visual cortex activation, but you still haven't explained the feeling of seeing the color blue.
That's the essence of what's called the explanatory gap. We can map the functional components, what some call the easy problems, but we can't map the actual experience. And no one articulated this failure better than Thomas Nagel with his famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?
Ah, the bat argument.
The bat argument. Nagel argued that mental states can't be completely reduced to objective physical states because subjective experience is intrinsically tied to a specific point of view, a first-person perspective.
Okay, let's use the bat example. We can study everything about a bat's sonar, right? We know the physics of the sound waves, the neurological architecture that processes the echoes, and how the bat's brain constructs a 3D model of its environment. It's all objective third-person data.
But as Nagel pointed out, having all that objective physical data, even if you know everything there is to know about the bat's physical systems, that does not tell us what it feels like to be a bat.
Right.
To understand the experience, you would have to adopt the bat's subjective viewpoint. And that viewpoint is fundamentally inaccessible to objective analysis.
That's such a powerful point. Reduction, by its very nature, requires a shift toward greater objectivity, toward a third-person, non-specific viewpoint. So if the essence of the phenomenon we're studying, consciousness, is that it is fundamentally first-person, then by reducing it, we're actually moving farther away from its real nature. We're destroying the very phenomenon we set out to understand. We're killing the frog again.
It demonstrates that subjective experience is resistant to being functionalized. It can't be fully captured by just describing what it does or how it works. And this resistance is what led the philosopher David Chalmers to refine the challenge into the now famous distinction between the problems of consciousness.
Chalmers' distinction between the easy and the hard problems. We hear that a lot, but let's really slow down and define the difference clearly.
Okay. So the easy problems of consciousness are essentially problems of functionality. They include explaining how we discriminate stimuli, integrate information, report on our internal states, or focus our attention.
So they're not actually easy.
Not at all. They're incredibly difficult scientific problems, but they're considered easy in principle because we can theoretically specify a physical mechanism, a computational or neural mechanism that performs those functions. We know we can map the function to the physical brain.
So an AI learning to recognize a face is an easy problem. An autonomous car reacting to a stop sign is an easy problem.
Correct. But the hard problem is the core mystery. It's explaining subjective, intrinsic experience. Why, when the photons hit the retina and the brain successfully processes all that information, does that result in the experience of seeing the color red, rather than just non-experienced information processing? Why does the system feel like something to the organism?
And that distinction is so vital because even if we achieve a perfect, total functional explanation, if you know exactly how the brain processes stimuli and integrates information, the hard problem is still there. We still haven't explained the feeling, the qualia.
Which means, when you apply it to subjective consciousness, the purely reductive method is fundamentally impotent. Functional performance doesn't account for the intrinsic nature of the experience itself. If consciousness extends beyond just functional performance, then physical facts cannot metaphysically necessitate phenomenal facts.
So if the materialists can't explain that gap, philosophers are forced to test the absolute limits of the concept, which leads us to one of the most compelling and honestly unnerving thought experiments in modern philosophy. The philosophical zombie, or P-zombie.
The P-zombie argument is powerful because it uses what's called modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity, to attack physicalism. A P-zombie is defined as a being that is physically and functionally identical to a conscious human, but entirely lacks conscious experience.
So, okay, if I meet a P-zombie, they look like me, they talk like me, they react to pain by flinching and saying, ouch. But inside, there's nothing. There's no feeling. The lights are on, but nobody's home.
That's it, exactly. They are purely functional machines. Chalmers and others who use this argument contend that a P-zombie world is logically possible. Not that it exists in our world, but that the concept itself is internally coherent.
And why does the mere logical possibility of a P-zombie matter so much to this whole debate?
Because it acts as a refutation of strong physicalism. If physicalism is true, then all facts in the universe, including the fact of conscious experience, are determined by physical facts.
Okay.
So if a P-zombie is physically identical to a conscious person yet lacks consciousness, it means that consciousness must be a further fact. It's something extra on top of the physical.
I see.
In philosophical terms, if P, all the physical facts, is true, and yet P-zombies are still logically possible, it proves that P does not logically or metaphysically necessitate C, conscious facts. If physical facts don't necessitate phenomenal facts, physicalism as a theory is false. This is the modus tollens of the argument. If the logical possibility holds, the premise of strong physicalism just falls apart.
That is unsettling. It forces you to confront the possibility that we could have a scientifically perfect map of the brain, a complete physical description, and still be missing the single most important element of human existence: being.
It highlights that explanatory gap at an ontological level. However, you can bet the physicalists hit back hard on this, and they often attack the very first premise, the conceivability of the P-zombie.
So what's the major physicalist counter-argument?
The most famous one comes from Daniel Dennett. He argues that P-zombies are not logically conceivable because when philosophers try to imagine them, they inevitably underestimate the sheer complexity required to be truly functionally identical to a human.
So he's saying we're not imagining it properly.
Essentially, yes. He argues that if a being were physically and functionally identical down to the microscopic level, that identity must entail the internal feeling, or at least the belief, that they are conscious. Dennett coined the term Zimbos for this. A Zimbo is a P-zombie that also has second-order beliefs. They think Z, they're conscious, and they think Z, they have qualia.
Wait, think Z with a Z.
With a Z, to distinguish it from actual conscious thought. Dennett argues that if a system is functionally complex enough to behave like a human, to write poetry, complain about pain, discuss philosophy, then those behaviors are themselves physical facts of the identical brain structure. To functionally behave as if you are conscious is to be conscious, or at least that belief is functionally identical to consciousness.
So the materialist essentially says, look, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and believes it's a duck, then the concept of a non-feeling duck is just incoherent.
That's a really good analogy. They claim that consciousness isn't some magical extra ingredient. It's just the name we give to the incredibly complex functional organization of the brain. The functional identity is the phenomenal identity.
Wow. Okay, so regardless of who's right here, the sheer depth of this philosophical deadlock shows us something crucial. The map of reductionism is struggling mightily when it approaches the territory of subjective being. If we can't even define consciousness conceptually, how can we possibly expect our medical and psychological systems to treat the whole person?
Exactly, and this takes us from the theoretical failure of the map to the practical limitations of our current approaches to health.
Right.
Moving from the abstract mind-body problem into the clinical setting, we see the consequences of this reductionist thinking embodied in the dominant approach to illness today, the biomedical model of disease.
Okay, so what are the core assumptions of that model that really reveal its reductionist bias?
Its main assumption is that illness is fully accounted for by deviations from the norm of measurable biological or somatic variables. It's fundamentally mechanistic.
The body is a machine.
The body as machine. It posits that a disease is an objective entity, explained fully by physicochemical principles. Illness is a machine breakdown. And this model, crucially, embraces both reductionism, breaking the body down into component systems, and mind-body dualism, the separation of the mental from the somatic.
And the physician's job is to fix the broken part.
Precisely. This model tells the physician to concentrate on the real diseases, the measurable biological faults, and to often dismiss or sideline what they consider psychosociological underbrush.
I can see how that would play out. If a patient comes in complaining of debilitating fatigue and anxiety, and all the lab results are normal, the model struggles to account for their suffering because the objective physical map looks perfectly fine.
Exactly. The limitations are obvious. It systematically overlooks the social, behavioral, and psychological dimensions of illness and patient suffering. It encourages bypassing the patient's verbal account, their first-person experience, in favor of technical procedures, imaging, and lab measurements.
And that's exactly why this framework failed Elias, the data architect. He went to his doctor, he provided all his objective data, and the doctor saw a perfectly fine-tuned machine.
And if the problem isn't a mechanical one, then the treatment is restricted to chemical adjustments, prescribing an SSRI for anxiety, for example, without ever addressing the profound existential isolation or meaninglessness that might have triggered the anxiety in the first place.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for both the patient and the provider, because the core problem lies completely outside the mandated scope of the map.
It often leads to a phenomenon called somatization, where psychological distress actually manifests as physical symptoms because the patient learns, consciously or not, that the healthcare system is only equipped to treat the measurable physical problem. The map dictates what counts as reality.
So what's the alternative?
Well, this is what led George Engel and John Romano back in the 1970s to propose an urgently needed alternative. the biopsychosocial model.
The biopsychosocial model, or BPS, this seems like the absolute antithesis of reductionism in medicine. How does it shift the paradigm?
The BPS model requires practitioners to evaluate the patient as a complex whole being, where illness is the result of dynamic interactions between biological, psychological, and social factors. It's an integrated systems approach. It challenges that dualistic idea that a physician should only address the biological.
Let's apply this to a real-world problem. Let's use Elias as our example again. How would the BPS model advise Elias differently than the purely reductionist approach?
Well, a reductionist approach would focus on his cortisol levels, his neurotransmitter balance, his sleep metrics. It would prescribe a chemical intervention.
The usual stuff.
The usual stuff. The BPS model, however, would assess all three systems simultaneously. So biological factors are still important. Is there a genetic predisposition to anxiety? Are there genuine chemical imbalances? But then it would move to psychological factors. What are his thoughts and emotions? Is he engaging in self-isolating behaviors? Is his personal narrative one of control and optimization, leading to burnout?
And then the social.
And crucially, the social factors. Does he have a robust support network? What is his work environment like? Is his intense focus on data optimization a symptom of underlying cultural pressure or socioeconomic insecurity?
I think that third one is so often the key that gets completely overlooked. If Elias's anxiety is rooted in the social pressure of constant performance, no amount of chemical tweaking is ever going to solve the environmental stressor.
That's the power of the BPS model. It recognizes that social needs are determinants of health. Addressing an underlying social issue, connecting Elias to a community group, helping him set boundaries at work, maybe resolving housing insecurity for another patient, can often be the most effective intervention for mental health, sometimes far more effective than purely psychological or biological treatments alone.
But the implementation must be incredibly challenging, right? Our modern healthcare system is optimized for reductionist efficiency, quick appointments, lab tests, prescriptions. A holistic BPS approach requires time, resources, and a willingness to step outside that purely physical domain.
Oh, it is deeply challenging. Our economic model is optimized for measurable outcomes. It's so much easier to bill for a lab test and a drug than it is for facilitating meaningful community engagement or addressing the societal drivers of stress. The BPS model requires a fundamental shift in infrastructure and training, forcing practitioners to conceptualize the patient as a narrative entity, a whole person, and not just a set of measurable data points.
Speaking of narrative and addressing the whole person, this seems to require retrieving tools that we've sort of discarded. I'm thinking of this concept of psychotechnology tools for hacking human software, which the ancients seem to understand intuitively.
Yes. If reductionism is about external manipulation, psychotechnology is about internal transformation. The ancients, the shamans, the alchemists, they were expert psychological engineers, focusing on process, metaphor, and ritual to integrate trauma and create meaning.
That's where I heard the story about a psychologist using a community fire grief circle. Here's a modern, trained clinician in a Western context, treating patients suffering from what she called ambiguous loss, that untethered feeling Elias had. But she abandoned the clinical couch and medication.
And instead of analytic reduction, which would break down the problem into trauma points and chemical imbalances, she used ritual and shared metaphor. She created a container for collective suffering, allowing people to process pain through shared story and community presence, rather than through isolated clinical observation.
That kind of ritual taps into something ancient, something that Carl Jung recognized when he looked at alchemy. He argued that the alchemists weren't just primitive chemists, were they?
Not at all. Far from it. Jung viewed alchemy as a sophisticated system of psychological symbolism. The alchemists, he believed, were unknowingly performing a complex act of projection of the unconscious. Their efforts to transform base metal into gold were really metaphors for transforming their own psyche.
So the external chemical process was mapping an internal psychological process.
Precisely. The goal was the great work, or the opus, the transformation of the psyche toward individuation, which just means psychic integration or wholeness. It was a centuries-long, deeply engaged spiritual practice, a kind of Western yoga designed to metabolize chaos and integrate irreconcilable opposites within the self. The opus follows these distinct stages. It begins with the negredo, the blackening, which symbolizes the initial descent into darkness, depression, the nihilistic loss of value, the chaos and meaninglessness that Elias experienced. Then comes the albedo, the whitening, a purification which leads toward the rubedo, the reddening, or citrinitas, yellowing, symbolizing the ultimate integration.
So the stages of chemical transformation gave the alchemist a symbolic map for navigating inner turmoil and grief. By transforming the lead in the crucible, they were transforming the chaos within.
And that's the key psychological insight. The alchemist eventually realized that to achieve the philosopher's stone, the symbol of perfected wholeness, the lapis philosophorum, they too had to undergo transformation and become a kind of self-redeemer. This tradition honors the subjectivity and inherent complexity of the human condition, something the reductionist materialist map simply cannot accommodate. It deals in meaning and metaphor, not just in molecules.
Okay, so we've established that reductionism fails to explain consciousness and that it fails to treat the whole human being. Our final section brings us back to the cutting edge of science to see if technology can save the map, or if the territory of emergence proves too vast even for our most powerful computational systems.
Artificial intelligence systems, particularly deep learning models, are arguably the ultimate test case for reductionism. If we can build complexity from the ground up, can that complexity generate the non-physical reality of consciousness? This brings us back to that crucial distinction between types of emergence.
Right, we need to define emergence clearly again in this context.
Emergence describes properties or behaviors of a complex system that are not present in its individual components. A great example is water wetness is an emergent property of H2O molecules, but a single molecule isn't wet.
Got it.
In AI, we distinguish between weak emergence and strong emergence.
So what defines weak emergence in a system like a large language model or a complex neural network?
Weak emergence refers to properties that, while they might be difficult to predict from the component level, are ultimately explainable and deducible from the underlying rules, algorithms, and deterministic computational laws. The sophisticated pattern recognition or surprising creative outputs of an AI might seem magical, but they are a byproduct of vast, complex, but still deterministic algorithmic interaction. The system is still bound by the map of its code.
So even if the output of a system like AlphaGo completely surprises its creators, that unpredictability just reflects algorithmic complexity, not genuine novelty or independent will.
Exactly. It's a deterministic outcome that is merely beyond our current capacity to track instantly. Strong emergence, on the other hand, implies properties that are genuinely novel, irreducible, and possess a new ontological status like consciousness or subjective experience.
So a strongly emergent property can't be fully explained by the parts alone.
Correct. It implies the whole possesses causal powers that the parts do not.
This distinction is perfectly framed by that thought experiment involving the digital frog.
Yeah.
I recently heard about a debate between a neuroscientist and an AI developer. The developer proposed building a perfect molecule-for-molecule simulation of a frog's brain, a digital frog, inside a supercomputer. The simulation replicates the function perfectly. When the digital fly buzzes, the digital neurons fire, and the digital frog catches the fly. The simulation has a perfect map of the frog's biological function.
But the neuroscientist countered with the key question: does the digital frog taste the fly?
Right.
Does it experience the qualia of hunger or the subjective satisfaction of consumption? This highlights the difference between pure symbol processing, which the simulation handles perfectly, and subjective experience, which the simulation lacks entirely.
The digital frog is processing the symbols, it's running the program, but it isn't being the frog. It has the map, but it isn't walking the territory of sensation.
And this challenge is precisely what John Searle addressed decades ago with his famous Chinese room argument. This argument directly attacks computational functionalism, the idea that the mind is essentially just a software program running on the hardware of the brain.
Okay, let's walk through the Chinese room.
Imagine a person locked in a room. They receive slips of paper with Chinese characters on them. These are the inputs. This person does not understand a single word of Chinese.
Okay.
Inside the room, they have a massive instruction book written in English. This is the algorithm, or the program. This book tells them exactly which Chinese characters to output in response to specific inputs. So, to an observer outside the room, the outputs are perfectly coherent and indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker.
So the person in the room is acting as the computer processor. They're just manipulating symbols based on a set of rules.
Right. They are mastering syntax, the rules for manipulating symbols, but they possess zero semantics, zero genuine meaning, understanding, or intentionality. Searle's point was that if the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, then the computer running the identical program also does not genuinely understand Chinese. It only simulates understanding. The AI, like the person in the room, may have an excellent map of how to respond to linguistic input, but it lacks the internal, subjective appreciation of the reality the map represents. It lacks intentionality. And if AI lacks intentionality and genuine understanding, the claim that complexity alone leads to strong emergence and therefore consciousness is fundamentally flawed.
This brings us to the ultimate constraint on the materialist map, doesn't it? The problem of downward causation. If consciousness or qualia were strongly emergent, they should be able to do something. They should have causal power.
That's the ontological stumbling block. Downward causation is the idea that the emergent property, let's say C for consciousness, can affect change back on its underlying components, P, the physical brain. If consciousness isn't just a passive side effect, if it isn't just supervenient, it should be able to influence the firing of our neurons and ultimately our action.
Which seems obvious, right? My thought to raise my arm causes my arm to raise.
It seems obvious, but reductionists like Jae-Gwon Kim argue that strong emergence and downward causation are fundamentally problematic because they seem to conflict with the causal closure of the physical.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means that if physics is a closed system, if every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, then introducing an independent, non-physical, emergent property like consciousness that can influence a physical event violates that closure principle. It would require consciousness to be a further fact that somehow reaches down and changes the physics.
So if an AI's sophisticated behavior is only weakly emergent, it remains limited to simulation. It's complex, it's difficult to predict, but it's still deterministic and functionally explainable by the code. The map is just really, really big.
Exactly. But for AI to achieve strong, emergent, genuine, subjective being, it would imply independent causal control over its components and true subjective experience. And under the dominant physicalist framework, this remains ontologically implausible because it requires consciousness to somehow bypass or supersede the known laws of physics that are governing the system's parts.
And so we find ourselves right back where we started. The map works perfectly for functional mechanics, but it cannot account for subjective being, whether we're talking about the anxiety of a data architect, the suffering of a patient, or the potential for a thinking machine.
And that, I think, is the synthesis we have to carry forward. The pervasive reductionist materialism of our time, this intense focus on the measurable map, has certainly given us technological mastery and incredible, precise insights into physical mechanisms. But this hyper-focus on the quantifiable has inadvertently led to a profound crisis of meaning, manifesting in rising anxiety, isolation, and mental health issues, the barren territory of the soul.
So whether we're grappling with the abstract problem of the P-zombie, pushing for the clinical integrity of the biopsychosocial model, or facing the challenge of artificial consciousness, the critical insight just remains the same. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Complex human systems require concepts like meaning, purpose, and community, the kind of wisdom that's embedded in ancient psychotechnologies that address subjective reality, not just chemistry and code.
The failure of reductionist perspectives to conclusively explain subjective experience and genuinely emergent properties is not a scientific dead end. It's an invitation to realize the limits of our current tools. While we rely on the precision of the map to survive in the external world, we need to understand and honor the vast, complex, irreducible reality of the territory to truly live. We must acknowledge that the physical facts of the world, while they are necessary for existence, do not metaphysically necessitate all phenomenal truths. We need an integrated perspective that honors both physical necessity and emergent subjective reality.